Welcome, everyone, to this TIPS Development Dialogue that's looking at public employment programs and the social economy, building pathways of support to livelihood and small business development. We've got three panelists. One of them is online and a discussant, and I'll introduce them as they come up. So we'll go in order of the presenters list on the invite. But just to say a few words around the importance of this work and how it's contributed to shaping our thinking in a really important area of public employment. It's part of a broader project that's been ongoing, that TIPS has been working with Dr. Phillips on, and just trying to better understand how we can grow the small business space, how we can support young people through public employment at a time when we're seeing a lot of youth unemployment and a lot of challenges in small business environment. We haven't seen the growth in the small business sector. Every time we have a shock to the economy, be it the global financial crisis or COVID or recession, we see businesses closing their doors. How to make businesses more resilient and how to give people a pathway that keeps them in a successful enterprise for longer is really important to how we understand the space, and building the capacity so that you go in with it to the enterprise with the right set of skills. So these are important things for us to consider and to discuss today. And TIPS is very pleased to be hosting quite an exciting panel, and it just builds on the work that we've been doing in this space. Allow me to introduce myself. For those that don't know me, I'm Saul Levin from TIPS, and our first speaker today is Dr. Kate Phillip, who's got a very impressive bio, but I'm not going to read even the short synopsis. But just to say that she's worked on public employment initiatives for at least 20 years now, maybe slightly less, and has worked in the social economy at least since the mid-1980s. So has got a deep and long experience of trying to work out how we get this right. And I think we've been through various phases, and the research behind all of that is really important. It's not to be underestimated. It helps us improve what we do, because these are things that haven't been tried in many places, and South Africa is now exporting some of these models. So yeah, over to you, Kate, and looking forward to your insights.
Thank you. Yes, one reaches a certain point where it becomes career limiting to admit quite how long one's been doing some of this work. So I'm going to frame the discussion really by just taking us a step back to understand our context, which, yes, we know, but at the same time, I want to frame it slightly differently. You know, we talk about the crisis of unemployment, and often when we frame it in that way, it's as if the people who are unemployed are the problem, and we must put our efforts into those people, skilling them, getting ready for the labor market, and so on. And yes, of course, that's important. But when we frame it slightly differently, we see a slightly different problem, which is that over the last decade or so, our economy has not absorbed more than 10% of the unemployed in any given year. That's a horrendous state of affairs. And that is just taking into account people who are actively looking for work. So this is the narrow definition, and it's an inconvenient truth that for the foreseeable future, large numbers of people willing and able to work will not be absorbed into our labor market, no matter how hard they look for work. So there's fairly little point incentivizing people to look for work. We don't have a shortage of people looking for work. When we advertised for our schools program for 250,000 posts, 1.5 million young people applied. An unwillingness to work is not our problem. Our problem is a lack of labor demand. And yes, we can assist people into that 10% cohort. And yes, there are issues of equity and who gets access to that. There are racial, gender, and spatial issues. And we need to support people to overcome barriers to being part of that 10% that do get absorbed. But we also need to recognize that to a certain extent, that is just affecting who gets to the front of the queue. It's not necessarily changing the length of the queue. And so we need a broader approach to what our strategies are in this space, because even if our growth strategies are successful, and yes, we all hope that they are, we all hope that all the structural reforms and so on that are underway yield the increase in labor demand that we want to see. But even if labor demand doubles or trebles or even quadruples in the next 5 years, more than 50% of those actively looking for work will still not be absorbed. So we need to look at this in perhaps different ways from how we have been doing so. We need integrated and differentiated approaches across the spectrum of those who are unlikely to be absorbed into the labor market. So yes, we need the partnerships that expand labor demand. We need all the interventions that do that. All strength to the clever people who are going to fix the economy on terms that include those who need employment. And yes, we need strategies at that interface. The fastest growing component within the unemployed is graduate unemployment. They're not the biggest group, but it is the fastest growing component within our unemployed. So yes, there are barriers to access, and we do need active labor market policies that support people at that interface, people who do have a decent chance of getting into employment and need support to do so. And so there are a set of strategies there. But what are we doing at the bottom end? What are we doing for people that are far from the labor market, who actually have quite little chance of getting into the labor market? So many of our strategies are predicated on the idea that success means we get people into the labor market. Certainly with public employment programs, often they're measured in terms of whether we can transition people into formal jobs. But that begs the question of what do you do when there aren't formal jobs? What do you do when actually labor markets cannot absorb people at the scale of need? And so this session today is very much about looking at, okay, so what do we do on the marginalized end of the spectrum? What are the strategies here? And the public employment programs are one intervention amongst a mix. They are not a silver bullet. And how do we ensure that these different interventions work together? So we have been looking at this, and within a framework that we've called Work South Africa, which is trying to look at how do we rethink this framework in order to build greater synergies and impact in this space. And GTAC has been doing some work in this space, looking at all the different kinds of interventions that are targeting people far from the labor market. And I think what is very interesting here is, firstly, I think it's important to make very clear that sometimes the policy debate has posed a binary choice between cash transfers like the SRD grant and public employment programs. We just don't see that as a binary choice. It's essential that a basic level of social protection is provided to everybody who is unemployed. The development of the SRD grant is new in our social protection space. It needs to be defended and protected. It is reaching more of the unemployed than any other intervention. And yes, we can talk about scaling public employment up to the level that the SRD grant is. But right now, we're fighting for the resources to maintain the level that we currently have. The chances to expand public employment to that level right now seem like a difficult policy choice, much as we think that is what should be happening. But the point is, these interventions interact. The more people that can be included in public employment, the less we'll need to depend on the SRD grant. But insofar as not everybody can be included, and there are some people for whom it is difficult to participate in work, people who are very poor, for whom there are constraints on their ability to participate in work, we need the SRD grant. So I think the first kind of important point is we need to look at the synergies between these interventions, not see them as binary choices. But then when we look at the rest of the kinds of they tend to be called active labor market support policies. We prefer to refer to them as strategies for economic inclusion, starting with the SRD grant and including support to SMEs, labor market matching, public employment programs, artisan development programs. So GTAC did this analysis of everything that is being offered. They used 2024 numbers. I think their PEP numbers are wrong because EPWP delivered 960,000 and we delivered 460,000. So the PEP numbers are understated. But even understated as they are, public employment is by far the largest category of support in this framework of support to unemployed people. And when we look at the number of beneficiaries of SME support of different kinds, it's actually pretty small. It's not reaching the kind of scale that is required. And part of the challenge is how do we look at these different instruments to see how they can complement each other? How can we use the capacity for scale that public employment has demonstrated as a strength in relation to other areas? So, that's fine. So what we're calling the Work South Africa agenda as the PMO in the presidency is a strategy to address the lack of coherence in the economic inclusion ecosystem. So much as we're promoting the role of public employment, we're also arguing for much more coherence in relation to the interfaces between these different areas of work. So on the left is what we have. We have all these different interventions. They are not particularly strategically coherent right now. What we need is these different interventions with greater strategic coherence, and that's part of what we're trying to achieve. And today, we're focusing in particular on that interface between public employment and livelihoods and small enterprise, and what the opportunities are in that space. So if I can shift now to focus particularly on public employment programs, the focus today is on some of the economic opportunities and that interface with livelihoods and small enterprise. So I'm not going into, the overall case for public employment, but I think it's important to make the point briefly. When we look at that row of people who are not economically included, these are people without access to economic participation. And economic participation in work. And I use the term work advisedly as opposed to employment. We need to enable people to participate in work of different kinds, because participation in work is so foundational to people's sense of inclusion and belonging and participation. The ability to support, to contribute to the household is a fundamental part of the social contract. And we know that when people are excluded from such participation, from participation in work, it has negative psychosocial impacts, it has negative effects on their social inclusion, it has effects on their self-esteem, and all of these negatively impact and ripple through communities as a whole. So there's a strong social rationale for public employment programs as part of social protection. These are critical. But here, the focus, I'd like to highlight the compelling economic rationale as well, because again, often in the policy debate, these programs are presented as if they're an extended form of relief. They in fact contribute in far more developmental ways. And I think in terms of the interface with small enterprise, a critical issue is that funds spent in these programs go directly into spending in local economies. And increasingly, we have the evidence that shows this. And when we look at the constraints on small enterprise, the focus tends to be on things like regulation. But every survey that I've seen, small entrepreneurs are saying one of their biggest problems is the market. And the markets are small because people don't have a disposable income. And so when you provide an economic stimulus into those communities, you're underpinning and supporting the possibility for entrepreneurial activity. Work experience. We know that the private sector says they don't want to employ young people because young people are unemployable because they don't have work skills. They're unproductive. And yes, that's a barrier to entry into the private sector. But there is research internationally, and we need more locally, that shows that entrepreneurs without work experience are more likely to fail. Now, in our context, where there's this vast number of people unable to get work experience because of low labor market demand, we need to create instruments that can give people that work experience and everything that it brings. Time management, task management, communication skills, access to networks, access to information, all of the things associated, the soft skills associated with productivity. This is vital for the economy, but it's also vital for the small enterprise sector. Of course, the quality of the work experience matters. And with good design, the work undertaken creates real social value in communities that are in need of that, and I'm sure Bhavanesh will speak to this further. The work can also support public goods and services that enhance the conditions for small enterprise to thrive. And we can think of a whole lot of examples, from community safety to infrastructure support to market facilities. Care activities unlock people's ability to, particularly women's ability to participate in work. There are all kinds of ways in which the work itself contributes economically. So what I want to speak to now is, very briefly, for those not as familiar with the presidential employment stimulus, speak a little bit to what have we seen in the presidential employment stimulus? What are some of the lessons we've seen around the interface and the ways in which public employment can support this interface with livelihoods and SME activities? And Zach and Bhavanesh will speak to this in more depth. In brief, the presidential employment stimulus was an example of not letting a good crisis go to waste. In the context of COVID, in the context of that crisis and the loss of 2 million jobs, there was a policy commitment to public employment at a scale that we haven't seen for a long time. And it created the opportunity to scale up public employment, to do it in different ways, to experiment, to place greater emphasis on the quality of outcomes. And amongst the many lessons that we've learned, today's focus is on this issue of the interface with livelihoods and small enterprise, particularly at the more marginalized end of the spectrum. I hope everyone here and online is familiar with the Basic Education Employment Initiative. It has become South Africa's biggest youth employment program. We have had a year's gap, but it is about to start again. It has employed about 200,000 young people per year in 23,000 schools, with an amazing spatial footprint, because every community in the country has a school. It provides fantastic work experience. It has a 97% approval rating from principals. It's a real asset in our overall ecosystem. The next level of challenge now, what if just one school assistant at each of those 23,000 schools became self-employed when they left the program? That's 23,000 jobs. What if two of them paired up? That's nearly 50,000 jobs. We think there's a unique opportunity to use the platform created by public employment to take support to self-employment to the next level and to levels of scale, and with an institutional support scaffolding that can actually support that in new ways. And we are appealing to the small enterprise support ecosystem to join us on this journey, to look at what that can look like and how we can actually leverage the scale and possibilities of public employment in this particular space. Social employment, Bhavanesh will speak to. Just to highlight here, it is one of our flagship programs. We call it an innovation heartbeat in the social economy. It is providing work that serves the common good, but it's actually doing some of the most interesting work at this particular interface. I hope some of you are aware of what we've been doing in the creative sector. The creative sector stimulus has supported over 100,000 creatives, and it's not a classic public employment program. It's publicly funded employment that is supporting people in the creative sector to create new creative work and to employ themselves and others in the process. And most of the funding has actually gone to small enterprises and the self-employed. And we're seeing we've got fantastic data emerging. 42% of respondents said some of the jobs created had become permanent. We didn't expect that. That's a positive additionality. Many of them were able to leverage the public support to get additional income, a genuine stimulus effect from the sale of work produced, from royalties, from tickets, sale of rights, and so on. And many were able to leverage the public funding to get sometimes private sector funding and other funding as well for their work. So another example of where the employment stimulus has really supported a small enterprise push. And finally, all kinds of interesting examples. I mean, at the most marginalized level, this is just an example, an urban farming group. They started a savings group. They bought 2 pigs. Now they have 6. This is at the most marginalized end of how public employment can support inclusion. We've seen some interesting hybrid models, in particular MISA in Kochte, initiated a model where they used public employment to mobilize community participation in separation of waste at source. And in that process, created the minimum viable volumes for small entrepreneurs in the recycling sector. So a really nice example of a hybrid model. And then we see all kinds of examples of side hustles. So I'm going to end there. This is just to give you a taste of the question we're asking, really, which is, how do we take what we've learned? How do we take it to the next level? How do we use public employment as support scaffolding for wider forms of economic inclusion and participation beyond the programs?
Thanks, Kate. We're going to take all our presenters and then we'll do questions and comments after that. I think you've captured a lot of information in a few slides, but there's several reports on the TIPS website and elsewhere if people want to go into more detail on each one of those programs that Kate has touched on. Let me hand over then to Zach Issa, who's going to join us online. He's a program analyst at the Presidential Employment Stimulus Program, and he is currently doing his PhD, and I think is in London at the moment. Hope the PhD goes well. And yeah, we're looking forward to your insights. And I assume it's also going to be linked to your PhD, which you're looking at social protection and sustainable pathways out of poverty. Over to you, Zach.
Yeah, thank you very much, Saul. And thank you very much to the broader TIPS team for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. So it's always such a pleasure to go after Kate. She frames the conversation in such a brilliant way. But this year, more than 1 million people will participate in a public employment program in South Africa. And I really want to focus on how people can build more resilient, diverse, and productive livelihoods from these programs. And for a long time, in a context where unemployment is and remains the main determinant of poverty, public employment has acted as a form of social assistance to protect people from social and economic vulnerability. But as Kate mentioned, in 2020, the social protection landscape really shifted when the social relief of distress grant came online. And for the first time ever, working-aged unemployed people in South Africa had ongoing forms of income support, a role that public employment previously played. And as Kate mentioned, this has really shifted the policy conversation in public employment, with a lot more emphasis being placed on its role in active labor market policy and the added value of participation in work. And the expectation that's then been placed on public employment is that these programs take unemployed people, incubate them for however many months, where they build skills, gain work experience, and then enter formal employment or viable entrepreneurship. So this is the policy backdrop, and it's really a conversation I want to challenge and try to reframe in my input today. So as Kate mentioned, this isn't a skills problem. It's not a motivation problem. The missing jobs crisis is a structural economic reality that no amount of work experience can overcome on itself. And there's many ways of representing this problem. Kate used a line of 100 people. Maybe two numbers that I think are really important is 12.4 million and 800,000. 12.4 million being the total number of unemployed people, including discouraged work seekers. So these are people who can work. And then 800,000 is the total number of jobs created by the formal sector in the last 10 years. And just to frame this in a different way, if we have to imagine that what Kate mentioned, a line of people, if that line of people had to line up outside the Department of Labor in Pretoria, it would streak through Africa and we'd end up somewhere on the border of Egypt. So it really is a long line. And if we have to also imagine lining up 800,000 people, the total number of jobs created in 10 years, that line barely goes past Limpopo. It doesn't even reach the border. So fundamentally, and the reality is that the bridge is falling short. And this is not a supply side problem. And in response, many have looked to the informal sector or to self-employment to take up the slack. But on its own, the evidence suggests that this is not necessarily a viable strategy either. The ILO did a working paper that's a literature review from various economic contexts, and they showed that self-employment, particularly for young people, is often a highly vulnerable labor market status in terms of level of pay and job security that it offers. So in other words, self-employment is often precarious underemployment. So the point of departure is that when an economy's capacity to absorb labor stagnates, there's very little a public employment program can do to ensure that participants are able to exit into formal employment or viable entrepreneurship. But there is something public employment can do. And the key message and point I want to make today is that public employment succeeds by supporting participants to build more resilient and sustainable livelihood portfolios, not just when it leads to formal employment or viable entrepreneurship. So the point about livelihoods here is an empirical observation that many people have made, that livelihoods are about more than just whether someone is employed or unemployed. And you walk through any township or rural community in South Africa, and you rarely meet someone who relies on one income source for their survival. Harambee, for example, tracked 3.8 million young people on the SA Youth platform and found that only 10 to 15% of people stay employed, while 30 to 40% of people churn in and out of different forms of work, including public employment programs and short-term income earning opportunities. What you do find is people piecing together livelihoods through remarkable ingenuity, resilience, and courage against all odds. We see people combining temporary jobs with side hustles, with public employment, with social grants, with community work and mutual aid networks, and claims on their family and friends to make a living. And a lot of anthropological literature has shown us that this isn't necessarily plan B while people are waiting for a proper job, but for millions of people, especially on the broader continent and increasingly for young people in our country, these complex livelihood portfolios are the economic reality. But we often define these activities in terms of what they lack: informal, unemployment, instability, insecurity. And so when I say focusing on livelihoods, it's not about saying that a combination of activities is preferable to a proper job, but it is about saying that sustainable, well-paid jobs are not always accessible, especially for those on the margins of our economy, and that these diverse strategies for survival and resource accumulation need to be supported so they are more sustainable and resilient. From what we've seen in the presidential employment stimulus is that participants don't typically tend to follow a linear path straight to formal employment or entrepreneurship. Instead, as Kate mentioned, people tend to use public employment opportunities as foundations, as support scaffolding to strengthen their existing livelihood strategies. So instead of seeing public employment as a bridge, we're starting to see it as the support scaffolding. It combines elements of social protection and livelihood development. And the idea is to take participants to the next level of economic participation, a step closer to a sustainable livelihood and a step further away from poverty, recognizing that each step forward is important. From a very practical perspective, there's three mechanisms through which public employment can do this. Wage income, but then also beyond a paycheck, the added value of participation in work, and then complementary livelihood support activities. And I'm going to touch on these briefly. So first, the wage income transfer is important because when a participant knows that their wage will arrive on time, they can plan, they can save, they can take risks to start new side hustles and ventures. And we've been seeing this in all our programs, including especially in the Basic Education Employment Initiative, where participants save their income to invest in inventory for weekend trading or to buy tools for side hustles or various other iterations of livelihood activities. Participation in work, as Kate mentioned, can also be a place to apply and build technical and soft skills, a place to develop social networks, and a place to boost dignity and self-esteem. We've seen this in programs supported by the National Film and Video Foundation, the Creative Sector Stimulus, where one of the organizations supported was Sunshine, an amazing NGO, and they taught participants valuable skills like project management and event planning. And so participants earn money while they're learning and they participate in work. And when they left the program, were more equipped for careers in the media, but also beyond that too. And finally, and where there's real room for partnerships with the SME sector, is that the design of public employment programs can also enable a series of livelihood or a series of complementary livelihood services. In the presidential employment stimulus, and particularly in the social employment fund that Bhavnesh will talk to, the design of the program has helped facilitate market access for smallholder farmers, help participants to form savings and buying groups, to help people access productive assets. So for example, using tools from work sites to start side hustles. And we've seen social enterprises, especially in the early childhood development and recycling spaces, being incubated through public employment. But crucially, public employment programs do not have the budget or the runway to fully explore these avenues. And so collaborations with the private sector can extend the potential of what these programs can do for livelihoods. And as a brief aside here, there's a few opportunities for partnership with the SME sector in this regard, in terms of creating aggregation platforms where small-scale producers can collectively access larger markets, financial inclusion services and access to cheaper credit for participants wanting to start ventures, to connect participants with enterprise development agencies, business training and mentoring, or to establish better market linkages where SMEs can provide inputs or purchase outputs from participants. The final point I want to make is that while there are a lot of opportunities to improve people's livelihoods through public employment, progress will not be the same for everyone. I think it's a quote by Einstein that says, everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. The point here is that we need to consider context when thinking about public employment's role in improving livelihoods. These programs, as Kate mentioned, effectively reach every single community in South Africa. They reach such a variety of people, the chronically unemployed and the people just on the brink of accessing formal job opportunities. And each of these factors creates constraints or opportunities that could or could not translate into economic progress for different groups of people. On the individual and household level, factors there shape what's possible. A young single person may be able to save their income to start a venture, while someone who supports a family or extended family may not. Someone who has work experience can maybe leverage the employment opportunity in different ways to someone who's chronically unemployed. The way we design our programs can enable or limit livelihood pathways. If we design programs with shorter work experience times, there's less opportunity to build skills or to build networks. If we increase the wages, there's more opportunity to save, but it means we reach less people, etc. And there's things we already know, that the communities people live in are really important, and that we live in an unequal society with concentrated markets that make small business entry extremely challenging, with spatial apartheid that influences access to economic opportunities, and limited access to land, which limits agricultural livelihoods that may work elsewhere. It's essential to understand these factors as conversion factors in some ways, if we want to design livelihood interventions that actually translate into economic progress for different groups of people. To close, just a few points on policy strategy. The first is we need to rethink ideas of graduation. When people leave a social protection program, they shouldn't fall off a cliff. They should be transitioning into different forms of support rather than exiting all forms of support. So for example, linking cash grants to public employment, linking public employment to other active labor market policies, etc. The second point is we need to recognize that different people require different levels of support. An unemployed graduate in Johannesburg may need CV help and job and interview preparation, while an older chronically unemployed person in the rural Eastern Cape with access to land may need agricultural extension services or market connections. Our support needs to match local realities. One size cannot fit all, which is the cardinal rule of development. And then finally, and importantly for this conversation, is we need shared responsibility for livelihood outcomes. Government and public employment programs can't do this alone. The vast majority of money in these programs goes directly to participants. We need meaningful partnership with the SME sector here, and we also need to ask, are our current SME support instruments fit for purpose for reaching these young people and vulnerable people? And if not, how can we ensure that they are? Because there's real appetite here for collaboration and for us to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zach. I think that helps to give a lot more context and some of the opportunities that we can get from really pushing and taking forward this type of initiative and program. Our next speaker is Bhavinesh Prabhu from the Industrial Development Corporation. He's worked in various aspects in the IDC on commercial side and development investments, but is now currently heading up the Social Employment Fund and working in partnership with the Presidential Employment Stimulus to create lots of jobs. He's a CA and has an MBA from Gibbs. And he's going to talk to us about social employment in building the social and solidarity economy. Thanks.
Morning, everyone. To everyone in the room and to the online listeners, it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to TIPS for hosting these sessions. I think they're incredibly valuable. I've sat and listened to Kate and Zach speak several times, and I learn things each time. So thanks for this. I'll speak about, I think, just three main things. The first thing is I'll give a brief overview of what the CEF does. The second thing, we'll run through a case study, so it'll make it a bit real. And the last thing is we'll look at three just important factors that I think are worthwhile considering in this space of policy. Okay, so just the mechanics of the Social Employment Fund. As Kate had mentioned, it is a public employment program. It employs 50,000 people on an annual basis on a temporary basis. And we work via what we call strategic implementing partners. These are civil society organizations which are located close to communities. And the premise is basically that a civil society organization, it's a community-based organization which understands the communities, understands community needs, therefore can design programs which are fit for purpose for the communities. Our implementing partners have to create work programs which employ at least 1,000 people. So this is the scale that Kate refers to. And they have to do, or have to create work which serves, their communities whilst providing, skills and meaning for the individual participant. A little bit of the mechanics of the fund is that, it's partnership between the presidency, DTIC, and IDC. IDC is employed as the fund manager. It's implemented again via these 40 partners, and the key point I would like to take away here, just by way of a data point, it's in this current round, we're in our third round of implementation. There are 2,400 community-based and other organizations which have been crowded in. So we as the CEF will work directly with 40 civil society partners. They, via their network, have crowded in at least 2,500. It's NGOs, churches, ECD centers, small businesses. Oftentimes, it's some public organizations as well. And that's that spiderweb kind of effect that we think is quite worthwhile talking about here. So let's look at a case study, and this is useful to look at and understand. So this is the Northwest Province. And we'll look at food security, which is a massive challenge in South Africa as a whole, but in particular, in the Northwest. So there's a small village called Deelpan. I'm not certain how many of you are familiar with Deelpan. It's about 3 hours west of here, not far from Lichtenburg. There's about 4,000 odd individuals who stay in Deelpan. There's 1,000 households. And as we've seen recently in the latest economic data, the Northwest is the province with the highest rate of unemployment in South Africa. Unemployment in small villages, however, is heavily magnified as opposed to the bigger urban areas. So this is a huge problem in this province as a whole, but in an area like this, it's specifically a massive challenge. Now, along with unemployment comes a shortage of job opportunities and skills for young people. So, how does one tackle this effectively? And in addressing this, our implementing partner, one of the 40, it's an organization called Sariti Institute. They designed a food security program specifically for the village of Deelpan. And what they crafted was the concept of an agri-node. Agri-node is a localized community hub which connects your smallholder and community farmers back to the market. It provides technical support and so forth. So they've helped to craft this with via the Social Employment Fund. Agriculture in the Northwest is the primary source of economic activity, especially for small villages like Deelpan. There are a number of smallholder and community farmers in these areas who oftentimes just do a bit of subsistence farming. And this creation of an agri-node has supported these smallholder and community farmers. So 590 individuals in Deelpan were provided with work. And they've helped or they've been plugged into these various community farms to get skills, to get work experience, and to boost the output of those community farms. And what's been some of the outputs? So firstly, there's 64 small community farms in Deelpan. Each one of them has increased their output. So there's economic activity and economic value creation. There's 1.6 tons of produce that has been created in that area of Deelpan for donation. So there are 2 public schools in Deelpan. There are a number of creches, NGOs, and so forth who are benefiting from this output of produce, and this is over and above the produce that was created for sale. And then importantly, I think of those 590 individual participants who were employed via the Social Employment Fund, 57 of them have been transitioned into permanent employment. That excludes anyone who started a small business, anyone who's gone on to study, which are also important parts of transition. And in this way, there's a variety of social value that's been created at a very localized level. Before our implementing partner decided to get involved and start work there, they spoke to the local authorities and got their buy-in. There was also some tribal land that was donated to this work as well. So in this way, there's a big buy-in from the community and the important stakeholders so that people feel that this is something worthwhile getting involved in, and there's a tremendous amount of buy-in. This is localized economic development done quite nicely. There's money exchanging hands in that local community. There's people solving their own problems in that community. There's individuals who are seeing themselves as really active citizens. If I go to work on a day, I'm producing vegetables and so forth, which I can use for sale. But importantly, if my yield and whatnot is worthwhile, the local school also benefits. The local creche also benefits. So there's a great amount of participation that's been created via a model like this. And like this, we've got close to 6,000 sites throughout South Africa where individuals are employed to work and doing good things. From a lessons learned perspective, I really like the slide that Zach had shared in terms of what do we think is worthwhile looking at. And I'll start with, perhaps for me, like the biggest lesson. There was the latest Nobel Prize in Economics, which was issued in 2024. It was to Danos Moglu, who's written that fantastic work, Why Nations Fail. And over a long period of time, they were asking this question, do strong economies lead to strong institutions, or is it strong institutions which lead to strong economies? That's a fundamental question that they were trying to solve. And what's meant by institutions, it's the rules of the game. It's how you contract, it's the cultural norms within economies, it's how you interact in business. And their research unequivocally has proven that strong institutions lead to strong economies. There's a clear direction. And what we found over here is that fundamentally what we are looking at creating via this employment fund is there's a strong institution of partnering that's been created. Those 2,400 connections that have been created via our 40 implementing partners, it's real life partnering. If you look at some of the foundational, founding documents of our democracy, whether it's the RDP, GEAR, the NDP, our constitution, it often talks about this issue of partnering. We want more partnerships, including partnerships with civil society. But the reality is that these haven't really materialized too often. What you find via this program, because there's a sense of agency and there's a big sense of ownership that's been given both to the implementing partners and to the communities involved, that partnerships are really forming. And I think this is what I think is, perhaps for me, one of the best things that's come out of this program. There's three other lessons which I think are worthwhile talking about, and there are policy people sitting in the room, and these might be interesting reflections. The first is this issue of politics and development. It's always a contentious issue. Politicians will always try and use development issues for driving a political agenda, and separating politics from development is often the case, not a good thing. But the Social Employment Fund is housed in the IDC. The IDC is a state-owned company, but it is quite divorced from national politics by virtue of the fact that it doesn't receive an allocation from the state on an annual basis. And why is this useful? It's useful because if you can somehow unmix or remove some of the politics from some of these development issues, you get to good local economic development. And what I mean by that is development issues, particularly the development issues that we're dealing with in South Africa, are very complex and non-linear. Take the issue of alien invasive clearing as an example. This a gentleman sitting here from Working on Fire. Alien invasive clearing, where you're going into areas and clearing huge amounts of hectares of land of alien invasive species. Many of our participants and many of our implementing partners are doing that at present. One would assume that the main benefit of doing alien invasive clearing is you are creating arable land and you are solving for water issues, which are definitely important benefits. But the other important benefit that communities feel when there's alien invasive clearing is there's a great sense of safety that arises, because if there's less bush, there's less wild land, communities feel a sense of safety. So if you are trying to solve the issue of safety without looking at the issues of ecology and greening and whatnot, you won't be able to do that. You won't be able to solve that issue quite effectively. My point over here is that these development issues are non-linear and they are difficult to solve. If you can somehow just keep the politics of it at bay and focus on development, it's a fantastic way of addressing things. The second thing, which I think is worthwhile talking about, and it's a masterstroke, I think, from Dr. Cates and the others who created the Social Employment Fund, it's to put civil society as the implementers of these programs. And why I think that's particularly important is that with a host of issues that we find in our country, at the bottom you find communities which feel disenfranchised. They feel like no one listens to them. They feel that politics and business simply just ignores their issues. So they have a sense of disconnect. And on the other hand, you have big business, you have politicians, you have the corporate sector and whatnot, which would like to drive particular agendas for positive or negative, whatever it is, but there's a disconnect between these two. And civil society sits kind of in the middle. They understand communities, they have agency, but at the same time, they have sufficient formality and legitimacy to go and speak to big business, to speak to municipalities and so forth. So having them as implementers is fundamental. And I think just the last thing, and it touches on what Zach was talking about earlier, it's, this is value of citizens, and I think seems to be getting lost in our political discourse, our economic discourse, and so forth. I've been involved in the Social Employment Fund for the last 3 years, and it's been a privilege to do so. Our participants in the CEF get paid 1,800 rands a month. It's not a lot of money, but I have seen on numerous occasions when we go out into the communities and see work sites that these individual participants will self-organize. No one's telling them to do so. And of that 1,800 rand, they'll take 50 rand a month or 100 rand a month. They'll put it together into a group saving scheme. And of their own accord, they will go and take that money and do something for the community, whether it's starting a food, a kitchen garden or something to do with children. So they're solving issues of their own. And this value which people are creating of their own, that's a real value in an economy. And I think via the CEF, this is what we are seeing, really fructify and come to the fore. So those are the few thoughts I'd like to share. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bhavanesh. Just, on your quote, maybe they needed a long analysis of this program because there's a lot of non-linear things that are happening. I think the linear relationships that they're trying to find, maybe they needed to look at how government contributed to growing the economy and then the role of institutions. So I think that the non-linear analysis is really important, and it gives us deeper insights into how these things interface with each other, and the goodwill that community members have for these kind of initiatives. Let me then hand over to Duma Ngubule, who is a columnist and independent economist who we've worked with for many years. Good to have you back, and he's also presented at many other TIPS events, so welcome, and looking forward to your comments on the presentation.
Thank you. You know what happened here? Thank you so much to the speakers. I was going to become a real discussant and not have a presentation. And while this was going on, I decided to have a presentation. But just as an introductory comment, yesterday, a friend of mine, John Lulu, he's the chief executive of the Small Business Institute, he called me to say something is really upsetting him. And he just wants to, let it off with me and to talk about it. He says he had to let go of an intern at the Small Business Institute. And he went out and asked for CVs. He got 2 CVs for an internship position from PhD graduates. That is absolutely shocking, yeah. And the second thing I want to say is that I was at the Harambee conference. The 2 of you were in a panel and on public employment. And, I was reading your document yesterday, your paper, first fantastic paper, and listening to the presentation. And what really upset me is that why do we have to make a motivation for public employment? Colin Coleman said, you must justify yourselves and you must give return on investment. And Bhavanesh said, it gave people hope. And for me, giving people hope was good enough. We don't need any other complicated return on investment. Why is it not obvious to people in government, to National Treasury, that we can't cut spending on public employment? I don't understand why it needs, so I decided to just, And the second thing I want to say is that most of you who know me know that I don't believe in half measures. It's either you want to solve a problem or you don't want to solve the problem. So just bear with me so quickly. So since the start of the pandemic, I've become, the false binary you're talking about. I've been at the center of the false binary. I worked for the Social Policy Initiative with Isabel Fry on the issue of universal basic income. I was part of the campaign. So we saw them, I saw them. I'm a newcomer to this. I was never always sold on the universal basic income, but during the pandemic, I became sold on it. I've never seen them as competing with each other. And I also worked with Youth Capital on issues of youth unemployment. So I was trying to, try and tell people, no, Isabel, they're not competing with each other, And I found this quote from Martin Luther King. My dad was a bishop in the Methodist Church. And if he had introduced me to Martin Luther King, I might have been more religious, But yeah, he was the original democratic socialist. He said, I'm convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, guaranteed income, what we now call universal basic income. We need an economic bill of rights. This would guarantee a job to all people who want to work. It would also guarantee an income for those who are not able to work. That's the job guarantee. So for me, they perform different objectives. So the universal basic income provides a dignity floor below which nobody will fall. So the way we've designed ours, we modeled it and we said it's for 18 to 59, like everybody else. Then I realized, I said, Isabel, this is not big enough. It doesn't provide enough of a stimulus to the economy. Let's give it to the children as well who get the child support grant. So it goes to adults and children, our version of universal basic income. And you talked about the multiplier effect in communities. And we commissioned a Brazilian researcher who did the work for us in terms of, they did studies of social protection in 42 countries. And we had a meeting with them, a meeting with him about his research. And he said, social protection multipliers in Brazil were higher than infrastructure in Brazil. That blew me over. And I said, Isabel, we've got to get this guy to do it for South Africa. So this person did it for South Africa and found that it has a multiplier effect of 1.74 after 10 quarters. So the money you spend comes back to the government, and our modeling showed 96% of the money comes back to the government. That's number one. Number two, so just a little bit about that. We are now an unviable society, second highest unemployment rate in the world after Eswatini. I went to school in Eswatini, and we were always number one on the ILO website. And I had to ask my school friends, what has been happening in Swatini that you went above us? 12.3 million unemployed and unemployment rate of 41.97%, 70.7% for youth, 46% for Africans, 50.1% for African women. Every quarterly labor force survey, I asked that to say, give me additional statistics the way I want them. 50.1% for African women, 52.8% in the Northwest, as you said, 1 million unemployed graduates. So the skills mismatch theory of unemployment is a fantasy. If the problem was on the supply side, there would be millions of vacancies. And it's an insult. I hear my friends say, people are unemployable. It's an insult to say that. So the world unemployment rate is 5.1%, and I counted on the ILO website that 80 countries have achieved full employment. So why don't we try to do the same? So I just want to say that in the work I've done, I've looked at the drivers of unemployment. The first one is the labor force growth rate. The 5-year, so I projected at about 2.3%. And just below the 5-year pre-pandemic growth rate. So the labor force growth rate times the labor force is the annual new entrants into the labor market. And based on these projections, there will be 740,000 annual new entrants into the labor market until 2035. So the GDP, the demand side, what Kate was talking about, labor demand, the GDP growth rate times the employment multiplier equals the employment growth rate. So the employment multiplier is 0.9. There has never been jobless growth in South Africa, and I'll qualify that statement. So from the first period from 2003 to 2008, when we were growing at 4.5% and we were creating 3.1 million jobs, we created, the multiplier was exactly the same for old people and for young people. So we created exactly half of the jobs for young people, half of the jobs for old people 35 to 64. And it was a multiplier of 0.9. For the second period, we created, so I'll come back to the second period, it was a multiplier of 0.9. So for 20 years of data, the number is choppy, goes up and down, but over the long term, that is the number, yeah. So the employment growth rate times then you get the annual new number of jobs created. And this model of mine, by the way, it predicted the number of people who would have employed at the end of the last administration. So it worked, sorry. So this is the first period when we're creating jobs, 3.1 million jobs. I really won't go into that in detail, but I'm just showing that people say there was jobless growth during this period. There wasn't jobless growth. So something strange happened here, Kate. And I talked to Dr. Lehotla about this. The labor force growth rate was much slower. It was 1.1%. And I said, Dr. Lehotla, why? He says, I don't know, maybe it was the AIDS pandemic. So we don't know. I call it an unexplained slower rate of the labor force growth rate. To this day, I don't know. So this is the last 15 years. So the labor force has increased. So this was the first period when we created jobs. Then the second period, our economic growth rate has collapsed to 1.1% a year. And we created the labor force, 8.7 million people, 8.7 million people, jobs, 2.3, formal jobs, 1.5 million. So this is what happened over the past 15 years. And then this is the most shocking one for me. Young employment for young people, 704,000 young people lost their jobs. So what does that mean? The economy created 3 million jobs for older people and shed 700,000 for young people. And I was trying to understand why were the multipliers exactly the same during the first period when we're creating jobs, and now the relationship, we now have jobless growth. So we have jobless growth for young people, but not for the whole economy, if you understand what I'm saying. So why? I think in an economy that doesn't grow, the employers had more choice. They have PhD graduates who are unemployed. And out of all those 150,000, how many people for the basic education? 1.2 million. Yeah, so that's the type of choices that people have. So what are the levers to reduce it? Obviously, it's GDP growth, industrial policies to increase this employment multiplier, and public employment programs. So those are the three that we have. And this is just the forecast under the current environment. And so I think we need a Marshall Plan for South Africa. We must understand the scale of our overlapping crisis. We can't aim a water pistol at a blazing inferno of unemployment, and getting 12.3 million people to work is equivalent of a war effort. We need GDP growth of just 4% a year to absorb the 740,000 new entrants to the labor market until 2035. We have to create 1.6 million jobs a year to achieve full employment. GDP growth alone is not enough. With 6% GDP growth, there'll be 6 million unemployed people by 2035. There's no single policy that will get us to full employment. We need multiple policies to address the multiple dimensions of this crisis. And the outcome of your excellent analysis on PEPs, which I've read before, we need to have scale. The tools to address the crisis and confront it, by definition, have to be very large. Yeah. So that's the last couple of slides, sorry. So this is in the budget. What happened here? This is my calculation, not the GTAC one, of what was happening last year in terms of public employment. It was a budget of 18 billion rands. And these are the work opportunities. And yeah, so different from the GTAC anyway. So as you said, you thought it was wrong. I also thought it was wrong. But anyway, so this is what happened in the budget. These are the budget cuts, which I really won't go into. And I think is that the end of it? Yeah, that's the end of it. So these are just my comments about this. And I just think that it is really sad that Kate and Bhavanesh have to be making this case. Is it not obvious to everybody from South Africa why we need to have these public employment programs? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Duma. I think your presentation as discussant worked really well. Thank you. And I mean, I think what we are looking at here is public employment programs are not just a water pistol, they're a cannon, but it is still a blazing inferno. The cannon is not going to help. We need the broader intervention. And I think that analogy is useful. We've got quite a lot of questions online and some comments as well, but let me open up to the audience first. If you've got questions or comments, please introduce yourself, and then we'll shift to the online one. They've been messaged to me, so then I'll just read it out so that it goes efficiently. Hands from people in the room, if you want to. Thanks. If you can just introduce yourself and then ask your question or make your comment.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Tebogo Loate from a community-based organization that's on the SEF project. Through the Learning Trust, we have a focus in the after-school academic support space. Just to Bhavnesh, maybe something that I think links back to what you were saying about, PEP, as well as combined with livelihoods and SME support. To give a practical example of our experience, we've been part of the SEF under IDC from inception. I think we are in the third round of the SEF. Something that has happened to us as an organization, while it's been absolutely fantastic in terms of the opportunities that it gave us as an organization to grow by leveraging the SEF participants. So a practical example, we run certain education programs in partnership with the private sector, typically large corporates that would like to get into communities and implement these projects. And we're able to leverage then our pool of participants on SEF to extend our programs into the communities, both for ourselves in terms of the SEF as well as the corporates. Now, where we face an issue though, Bhavnesh, is that from inception, we understood that our grant support to operate the SEF program is calculated on a per participant base. So it's a rand value per participant like you have with the schooling system. What has happened though is that from inception down to where we are in round 3, the number of participants has reduced by less than half based on what the IDC approved for our SIP. Now, the problem becomes then, our funding to support the SEF is reduced by more than half, and we don't have access as social enterprises to other instruments that can help us support it, because the functional requirements we have internally don't reduce by virtue of the fact that we're managing less participants. So it now become a cost to run the SEF on behalf of the IDC is the sad reality that we find ourselves in. So how do we then find other instruments within the SME support space to be able to, to support organizations such as ourselves? And then to Kate, I think we've had the discussion. I've bombed you on WhatsApp quite a while. Up until I met Kate, I didn't know that that PEPs actually had a face or somebody who's working on them. We've been trying to get into the BEEI program, and it seems there's nobody to talk to. So now I've been harassing poor Kate to try and get somebody to speak to, because we do work with schools. If we've got participants that are at schools under the BEI, we'd like to tap into that to expand our programs through the schools network. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay. Blake?
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Blaise Gondam from the French Development Agency, and we are here with colleagues following for a couple of years now, and even more the work of TIPS and the work on public employment, and really congratulations for the jobs done. I wanted to ask a very general question and a more specific one. The general one is, how do you people in the room, discussants as well as participants, relate these initiatives to the just energy transition, which is a big discussion theme with international donors and also with the National Treasury. How do you see the linkages between these and how to make meaningful ones? And the second is the issue of scale. So whether it's pistol or a cannon or even a bigger weapon. The issue is really how to transform these meaningful activities, I mean, from a human perspective, from a social perspective, how to transform them into economically measurable activities, and what argument can we make for the scale issue? How does it make sense to give more money to reach more people and so on? Thank you so much.
Thank you. There's a hand. Yeah, we'll do 3 questions now and then we'll take some more.
Thank you. Is it more? No, it's no longer morning, it's afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Nobuntu Sibisi from Nedlec. Thank you very much for this session and the presentations from the panelists. That's much appreciated. And it is just as a first comment, it is really heartwarming to see how these public employment programs have extended beyond the immediate job provision, but to be able to equip the communities for broader sustainability. My question is, within the presidential employment program, do you have the initiatives that in your assessment you would deem as not having been successful? And if you have, what have been the key challenges that impeded the success of those programs? And what could be the learnings that can be derived from your programs that can also be translated or applied in other public employment schemes? Thank you.
Thanks. Before you respond, and also Zach is welcome to respond from the UK side. Just a question that builds on from what Blaise was saying. It's a question from Neva. Is the issue around more resourcing to scale up the public employment programs and the SME pathways out of poverty, or are there blockages or obstacles to the scaling up? So is it just resources, or are there other obstacles? Are there not enough institutions? Those kind of things.
Can we take this round? Because it's a lot before the next one. So I should have made the connection to the just transition. I think absolutely everything that we've reflected on here is relevant to how we apply public employment in the just transition context, because we've certainly made the case that the transition from the jobs of the past to the jobs of the future in the context of the just transition will not be seamless, and that there's a critical role for public employment in that space. And so all the lessons that we're talking about here are lessons that we are actually applying in that context in the design of programs that look specifically to supporting the just energy transition. And I think the focus in this session on trying to look at the role of public employment programs in relation to livelihoods, self-employment, the spectrum of forms of economic inclusion, I think, are also particularly relevant for the communities that will be affected by that. On the issue of scale relates to a number of factors. At one level, it is a budgetary issue, but more budget won't help you if your design doesn't enable scale. So the issues are linked, and I think, you know, the presidential employment stimulus happened in a context in which our scale of public employment through EPWP had been static for about a decade. There had been no particular increase in scale. And we saw the opportunity to demonstrate that public employment can go to significantly greater scale if it's designed to do so. And we used a number of different modalities to demonstrate that. So the schools program, the modality is one of using a distributed network. So because you're going to 23,000 schools, each school only has to take 10 to 20 people to reach 250,000 people. That program could double in scale. It could probably triple in scale if the resources were available, but the mechanism has been demonstrated. It was not difficult for the schools to absorb that scale of people into their existing management systems. The other methodology for scale has been really one of crowdsourcing, if you like, a response from the society. So both in the Social Employment Fund, but also in the creative sector stimulus program, we issued calls for proposals against a set of criteria. So instead of, if you like, designing a program and then resourcing that program and having to implement in that way, the approach was to say who out there can deliver jobs against these criteria. And in both cases, the response was significantly greater than the resources available. So in the case of social employment, we had a very short lead time for that first call for proposals. I think it was 6 weeks. It was a new concept, a new program. IDC had never done this before. And communities had not been asked to respond in this particular way before. We had budget for 50,000 jobs. The response in terms of organizations that met the minimum qualifying criteria, we could have created 300,000 jobs. I have absolutely no doubt that social employment could go to 1 million jobs if the not overnight, but quite quickly actually, if the resources were available. So sometimes so resources are a big part of the problem, but it's not just about resources. It is also about design and not over designing. Lessons, yes, actually, in terms of I don't want to be too brutal about this, but we've started with over 15 programs. We're now down to 5. And a lot of that, not just 15 programs, 15 departments. And in each round, we have prioritized the most successful programs. So we are very appreciative of the efforts of all participants in the program over time. But there has been a process of prioritizing where the strongest impacts are seen. The lessons I'm going to refer you to, we have tried to pull those out on our website. So on a website, there is a document that speaks to those lessons, and I'd be very happy to talk to them, but it's a long discussion, so I won't go.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Kate? So you said it was 15.
Can we use the mic so the people online can?
You said it was 15, now it's 5. But surely there were others that were stopped. There were successes amongst them. Yeah.
I think part of the problem is that, if I may be blunt, it has been a challenge for implementing partners to understand scale. Many of the programs are designed as projects. There's a very strong project mindset that we've been trying to move beyond, because we're not going to crack this unemployment problem with the proliferation of projects. I mean, let me put it another way. At the most grassroots level, what CEF is supporting are projects. There are micro projects, there are small localized initiatives. But what we've tried to do is create enabling institutional mechanisms that can support that at scale, rather than an approach which focuses on an individual project at a time and tries to add those up to get to a cumulative effect. But no, you are right. There are programs that have been high quality that have also been cut. Yeah.
Go for it.
I think I'll just address that question by Teboho. It was around the support that is received post the CEF. So I mean that this is an operational problem. I'm happy to chat to you a bit more about this process, but I think just firstly, thanks for the work that you guys do. And I suppose just 2 things to just share is that I'd imagine via your NGO being involved in the CEF that you have grown and you have been strengthened, which if that's happened, I think that's important. The second thing is that, we've always kind of pushed it back to say, well, we're providing the scaffolding and the support for a period of time. What solutions can you provide back to sustainability and whatnot? I would almost throw that back at you, but happy to talk and engage in, with you beyond this. Maybe just one other point on this, this issue of programs being successful and lessons learned and whatnot. I think the big thing that we've seen from our side is this issue of stability and having certainty of programs. It's such a big thing. With our implementing partners, many of them have taken this challenge quite head on, and many of them are working in communities where they know that they have certainty of the program for a year. but not beyond that. And it's very very disconcerting. But I think if we can provide more certainty of policy and of programs, it'll go a long way in delivering, I think, better results.
Okay. Okay, I'll come to you now. I'm going to take two comments from online, and then I'll take the two hands in the room. Just also to reflect that we're also looking at the SME pathways, not just on the success of the program on public employment. So just to also maybe reflect on, what are the obstacles in terms of that, and why are we not, I'm sure we are seeing some people moving out, and not everyone's an entrepreneur, but how do we expand on the SME pathways? Just to reflect on that. Okay, then just comments from and questions from online. There were a few people who just needed technical information. So I don't know if we can pick up on that. I don't get hold of them afterwards. Some are asking whether private sector people can participate in the CEF program, when are you opening the next call, those kind of things. So I think those are important. But okay, so a question from Gwyn Foster for Kate is, has research included opportunities in the agri-info services sector? I don't know if you'll understand that. And then another one from Rachel, who's asking Zach, can you give an example of active labour market policies that must assist transition to the formal sector? Okay, let me go over to the people in the room.
Thanks, Hilary van der Kerk, Development Aid Consultancy. I was part of the review of the EPWP program back in 2013, and we did it again in 2015. And one of the key findings at that stage was that there's no policy coherence, vertical as well as horizontal. And it seems that nothing has been changed in that scenario over the last 12 years on that end. Because the other flavor of the day is evidence-based policy making. I didn't pick up anything on impact studies on any of the programs that listed in terms of this is the real impact. I'm just thinking in terms of Deelpan, what's the impact of a single household? What do they feel has improved? How has their income improved or whatever? Those are very expensive studies because you've got to go down in detail. So it's not cheap to do those type of impact studies. But I would really like to see some evidence of real research on impact of these programs, which I think would then create some basis for enforcing and initiating policy change on that. Thanks.
Okay, let's go to the colleague from Working on Fire, who will confirm that we need more than water cannons. We need planes with water to dive bomb those fires of unemployment.
Yeah, you need all the bombers and everything. I just want to ask, we heard just transition, so the climate change issue. Is that in any way influencing a sort of prioritization of area? And I say particularly in terms of adaptive and mitigation areas. It's most the marginalized communities are likely to be suffering the most impact. We've seen the floods, we've seen the fires, and it's global. It's not certainly local here. Is that influencing sort of some sense of prioritization, because we don't see it? I attended a recent fire brigade services meeting, and it's horrific in terms of what they're looking at in terms of their budgets. So we don't have the capacity. Meanwhile, we're being choked at the moment.
Okay, do you want to respond to that set of online comments? My pivot back.
I hope I remember. I think in terms of the interface between public employment, livelihoods, and small enterprise, I think part of the problem is that we need more strategic coherence in terms of strategies for economic inclusion. So the slide that I showed, the Work South Africa concept, which shows these different components of support to unemployed people and to people who are not employed, are not working synergistically. So support to small enterprise, public employment, the grants, trainings and skills development, capacity development, labor market placement services, all of those are working in a way in silos. And so the Work South Africa concept is trying to respond to the policy issue that you raise, which is the need for more strategic coherence. And because of that lack of strategic coherence as well, the barrier to speak to Neva's question is very much that linkage is not embedded in design. And so insofar, for example, as programs in social employment are managing to support these livelihood connections beyond the program, it's not something they're funded to do. It's not something that has explicit support. And that is a policy issue that we're trying to change, to say that if we're going to have more integrated approaches and we want and we recognize that public employment programs can't just be a simple stepping stone into the formal labor market. If we're seeing that actually we need much more focus on the economic inclusion dimension, then we need to resource that. I mean, yes, good work is being done, but better work could be done if that was more formally integrated into the design of the programs and the support, the program management support that organizations are getting. Climate thing. Our focus in the employment stimulus in that regard has been on the just transition and how do we pivot the programs that we have to add additional value in the context of the energy transition. I think within programs like social employment, there is a stream that is strongly focused on the climate issues. I mean, I think in EPWP there always has been an environmental component, if you like, but I do agree with you that there is a lack of policy drive, if you like, to the wider climate adaptation mitigation agenda. The focus is on the just transition, but that sits within a wider challenge, if you like, on climate. And I agree that we could be doing a great deal more in that space.
Happy to take the question on impact. So I am talking to the CEF specifically here, just in terms of what we can do if we are looking at proper impact. So for the CEF, we measure impact at 3 levels: at a participant level, at a community level, and at an organization level. So we're quite deliberate about those markers. We get an independent impact evaluator to come out. And based on a set of terms, they go out and they evaluate anonymously, and then they report back to us. I think what we found in the first impact study is that at least 2 rands of value is created for every rand that has been put in. And what's meant by that is that it includes value to the community, value to the organization, value generated by the good work done, and so forth. They've tried to quantify it in a way that we can easily communicate. Maybe just 2 other things to address is that it's very difficult to try and quantify some of these things, but having good KPIs and whatnot to continuously measure is critical, but it's complex. Second thing is we're trying to adapt and learn and do things better. So in this round, we've got the Green Light survey. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with them, but that's a household survey looking at poverty, income, distress, and so forth. And that's going to be distributed around the households that we work within. But I agree with you. I think the more we can measure impact and report on that impact and evolve how we look at impact, the easier it is to become, to have those policy discussions.
Just the 2 technical questions. When are you opening up the next call and who can participate?
Sure. It's anyone who is a non-state actor is allowed to apply.
Okay.
They have to meet a certain set of criteria, which are listed on our website.
Okay.
Have sufficient institutional capacity and so forth. We'll be announcing a next window, I think, within the next month. But I think that date isn't set as yet.
Okay. I'd like Duma to also talk a bit about the impacts, not the direct impacts, but the macro. I mean, you touched on it, saying that it pays for itself, or it almost pays for itself. So it seems to me a no-brainer.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, so maybe I'm too close to it. I've read all Kate's reports, and the impact is obvious. To me, it's obvious, but you can take a crude measure of the budget, the number of participants, and maybe you guys could maybe do more of what Bhavanish is saying to answer the naysayers. But for me, who reads all the reports, it is good enough. You know, I don't really require, if I was the decision maker, I would need more, I would not need more information. And I would trust them to be able to say, this doesn't work. And, you know, these are good civil servants, you know, this doesn't work and this does work. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, I just think that people mustn't put too many obstacles that are unnecessary in terms of this thing, because this thing, you know, it spread like a wildfire, and it wasn't, people want to control it and all that and put all these little Excel spreadsheets and all that stuff. Yeah, it has, yeah, I don't know, man, like maybe it's maybe, I don't know.
Okay, so we could get the water bombers in through this program, but okay, I don't know if there's Zach there was a question to Zach. Let's take his insights and see what.
Can I just ask Zach to also talk to the research facility on the research?
Okay.
Sure. I think if I can briefly also add to what's being said about the role of public employment in the climate crisis. I really think we need to understand the scale of what the climate crisis means. You know, on the one hand, it's installing new turbines and wind turbines and solar panels and supporting workers who will be displaced. It's a very clear role for public employment in both of those. But we fundamentally need to transform our society, the way we grow food, the way we deal with waste, protect our water, our soil, our biodiversity, and so much more. And a lot of these is about the creation of work that's not going to be done just by the private sector. So on the point of climate adaptation, on the global goal of adaptation that was announced in the UAE at COP29, I believe, social protection was one of the goals. And across the continent, it's being seen as a crucial part of adaptation. So you can employ people to do things like, and that's already been done to some extent, like protecting catchment management areas and the work that people like Working for Fire are doing. But then also it's adaptation on a very local level where people can diversify their incomes away from climate vulnerable livelihoods and job opportunities. So there's lots of linkages, and I think we should be doing a lot more exploring in that regard when it comes to the climate crisis. On the point of active labor market policies that might transition people into the formal sector, I think the Basic Education Employment Initiative is one example of what an active labor market public employment policy could look like. It reaches what Kate showed us, the line of 100 people. It reaches people that are closer to the ones who can access job opportunities. And so I think that as a short-term work experience that generally lasts around 6 to 8 months and focuses on skills could be a good way to transition people into more formal employment. In terms of the research program, I think one of the big limitations that we faced around advocating for public employment is there isn't any budget to fully understand the impacts of these programs. And while there's a lot of innovation happening in the policy conversation, the academic conversation hasn't quite spoken the same language, where a lot of the impact has been focused on to what extent does poverty, or to what extent is poverty reduced through public employment. And so over the last year, we've been working with various partners, all of the presidential employment stimulus programs, with various civil society organizations and academics to craft a research program around public employment programs that focuses on the added value of participation in work. We're hoping to start it later this year. We'll focus on the added value of work for people in terms of livelihood outcomes, in terms of psychosocial outcomes, focuses on the added value of work for the economy in terms of multipliers and active labor market impacts, focuses on the added value of work in the climate crisis, in terms of the just transition, adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity, and finally, in terms of the social value of work for our society. And so hopefully can have more robust academic conversation about how to maximize the impact and potential of these programs in the country.
Okay, thank you. I've got some hands online and I see there was one more hand in the room. So let me do 2 online and then the hand in the room, and then we can take another round after that. There's also still some more comments that I'll get to shortly. Okay, so let me ask Nompulelo to ask a question. Nompulelo, do you want to unmute or? Okay, Can she be unmute? There we go.
Good day, Chair, and everyone in the platform and in the meeting. I'm Nompelo Daniel from Buffalo City Metro, and mine is just a simple one, I think. Buffalo City has benefited a lot from some of these public employment programs, especially in the space of waste service provision, and also programs to enhance recycling. But there are some challenges that we are facing. We are using the community-based approach, where we are taking participants from the communities to assist in the provision of the waste service, actually to just to augment the municipal staff in order to improve the waste services, and also to cut down on certain areas of expenditure within the municipality, for an example, your overtime expenditure. But what we have realized is that some of these participants, or most of these participants, are youth that is educated, some of them even having degrees, but they are unemployed, and some of them for quite a long time since graduation. Then after a year, because the program, the contracts that we normally sign with them are just a year's program, and at the end of the program, you find that they go back to being unemployed. We do encourage them to also to venture in perhaps establishing their own cooperatives, where they can run their own waste buyback centers for recycling. But we find out that most of them are actually, they are just not confident or even comfortable to, to get into that space. So I would like to find out as to whether there is any step-by-step guideline as to how we can support them as a municipality in order to strengthen them at the end of that 1 year contract, so that they can be sort of empowered and made to be comfortable to get into that space of either establishing their own cooperatives or small SMEs. Then the next one, on the issue of the GDP or issues of economics, I think our other challenge is as Buffalo City, as you can see geographically, we are very far from where most of the economic activities of the country are happening. So when you are engaging, for an example, in a waste management program like recycling, it needs to be supported by big industries where they can take, or, they can take some of the waste and put it into recycling. So we are far from those industries. So you find that some of the recycling programs that we are starting, they are not sustainable. And amongst other things, I think the issue is our geographical location and also our proximity to the recycling markets. And then thirdly, I also
can we stop there? Thanks. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Thank you, Nompulela. I think you raised some important issues, which we'll ask the team to respond to. Gwyn, do you want to unmute and ask your question? If we can try and limit it to one, possibly a short second one. Thanks. Go for it, Gwyn.
Okay, thank you. I can unmute. This will be very quick because the discussion is going to be worthy of a hell of a lot of interaction. I find there, to me, people with money in their pockets are food secure. If we are looking at sustainable projects, we are looking at taking projects, taking initiatives to the point where the recipients, where the beneficiaries are in a position to continue commercially. We are looking at commercial sustainability. The impact, the opportunity is absolutely huge. We have got a clash between agricultural development and the climate situation. We have got the carbon economy, that is a 5-year project, which is ideal. Carbon economy, completely new data streams. Completely, we've already just had the first global carbon assessment. The next one is in 2028. Information is vital, absolutely vital. So whatever I've heard today is great at a local level, at a survival level, at a subsistence level. It is not okay for a commercial level. That is where people hit the record barrier. That is where people hit the food safety barrier. And now we are getting the climate one. Without question, it is being used politically. So huge opportunity. Yes, there is a need for national programs. I fully accept. I have given up on most. I have run national programs before. I am an ambassador for the Cambridge Democratizing Education Program for Sustainability Justice. The next round is about to open up. It would be great if everybody on this call were to sign up. They are subsidized for the people who are accepted. Let's get that message out there. The youth are vital. We do not need a degree in order to think. These people are not stupid. Our education system is down the drain. Huge opportunity. How do I take it forward? I can write to you whatever and give you where we are. I'm talking about the Market Access Services Program, MASP. I'm working with the People in Parks program because it is not within government structures. There are 20 years present, etc. So
thanks, Gwen. Okay. There's a hand over here in the room. And then we'll have a quick response, and then we'll do one last round with people online. And I see there's another hand over here.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Maurice Ngwana from the city of Ekurhuleni. And thanks very much, Kate. I think we've been participating in the public employment, I think, since 2001. And over the years, we have picked up that as long as we bring in the candidate to participate in the program, the sustainability thereof lacks. The question is always going to be direct because we've been taking them in and then leaving them out, for a duration of a year. And then only after a year, they'll come back, after, the third year or fourth year, simply because they're unemployed. But then what we've picked up as well was that there were some loopholes in terms of our regulations. Some of our policy actually has to be adjusted to fit actually this candidate back into the system. Whenever they open vacancies, the vacancies become open into our structural positions. But at the same time, we've picked up that the municipalities at the present moment may not be in a position to absorb a total of 30,000 within a financial year. So therefore, we are opting actually into entering into the private sector institution. We're inviting the private sector institutions. But at the same time, the only issue that we have is the best approach to partner with the private sectors. We have identified, several institution. We've identified as well a niche market through the last mile delivery drivers. So that's one of the projects that we're currently implementing. But then we still back in terms of the project and the process. How best then we can we partner with the private sector? I think maybe the colleagues might actually assist us in terms of if there is a step guidelines on how we can partner with the private sector. I mean, at the end of the day, we don't want this case to move up, but we want to make sure that there is a sustainability, in terms of this created employment. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to throw some more in the mix from online comments. So we've got a question on, just the demographics of South Africa. I'm not going to read the whole question, but employment is created in the metros. How does this program support people who are out of the metros with employment? And then another one on what is the role that civil society can play in promoting the program design?
So quite a complex set of questions. I'll try and answer. I think the first thing is, it actually breaks my heart when one hears these stories about organizations who have been able to ramp up with support, and then when budgets get cut, they have to ramp down and aren't able to provide support at the same scale when the scale of need is so enormous. So we do have this ongoing challenge that Duma was particularly vocal in articulating, that there's a need to recognize how important these programs are in maintaining inclusion of citizens in the economy and in the society. So I don't have easy answers to the challenges that organizations face when budgets get cut. We're all grappling with this issue in a sense, and what we really need is significant expansion. I think also there's a sub-theme in the questions about the difficulties of people transitioning, and I think it's very much what Zach was speaking to, that we need to see these programs as part of a livelihood basket that is contributing to multiple different sources of livelihood and income, because that is how people are actually surviving. And we know that, all the data that we've shown is trying to illustrate that it is not a realistic expectation that everybody who exits from these programs is going to go into formal employment. And so we have to start thinking differently about economic inclusion for those who are not going to transition easily. And that does mean people coming back after a year and still they're unemployed. And right now our policy debate is trying to make the case for public employment, and a big part of that case is around these issues of transitions. But in a way, there's a point at which we need to go the next level and recognize that when unemployment is as deeply structural as it is in our context, public employment might need to be an ongoing part of support scaffolding to keep minimum levels of employment in the economy, because employment matters so much to people, because participation in work matters so much to people. And in this regard, I'd like to compare us to India. India has the world's only legislated employment guarantee at a significant scale. 60 million people participate every year. It's only in rural areas. But for me, one of the interesting features amongst many of the Indian program is that there is no expectation that people transition. It is recognized that seasonal underemployment is a structural factor that is permanent in the Indian countryside, and that it's not a problem that people can solve individually through better skills or whatever. It is a structural problem. And so if you Google exit strategies and transitions from employment in India, you will find nothing, because it's not part of their thinking. In their thinking, they are dealing with an ongoing permanent structural problem that needs an ongoing permanent provision of public employment 100 days a year on an annual basis. It's a very different mindset from how public employment is seen here, which is very much as a stepping stone, and a stepping stone to what? So that's not to say that we can't and don't impact as well as possible on the pathways into employment and the pathways into livelihoods. But part of the discussion here is about recognizing that we need to do this better. We need a better partnership with a small enterprise support ecosystem. This kind of support is not built into the budgets of public employment programs. It's not an assumption that these programs are resourcing transitions into self-employment, livelihood activity, various forms of economic inclusion. And we're now interested in exploring what can that look like. Building on the experience, for example, with social employment, what can that look like in practice? On the spatial issue, I think the point about the Basic Education Employment Initiative is precisely its incredibly equitable spatial impact. Every community in the country has schools. All schools in the country have teachers' assistants through this program. And the bias in these programs is towards more marginalized and underserved areas across all of the public employment programs. I think I'll leave it to others to pick up.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we've got time for one last round, and there were 3 online and 1 in the room. I'll take the 1 in the room. If I can ask everyone to keep it short so that we can get through.
Hello, my name is Helene. I work for the French Agency for Development. Thank you very much for your intervention. Very inspiring. So my short question is about the unexpected or unforeseen effect, multiplier effect on the creation of community group of savings through the social employment fund. And considering the fact that on the SEF, you also build more resilient enterprises with guaranteed market access. And we know access to funding is vital at the initial stage of enterprises, and that they don't find this seed funding within commercial system. But at the same time, those they have access to funding through this community group of savings, they also need support to manage for the first time debt, maybe at some time, learn to repay, to pay back, to make this tool sustainable, revolving, and in order to achieve this multiplier effect. So they need also support and technical support to grow their enterprises. So back to your initial slide on how to connect the PEPs with existing SMME support programs. How do you assess the opportunity building on what the lessons learned from this PEP on enterprises and the existing SMME program? How do you assess the next steps, the opportunities? Thanks.
Okay, online people, we had Simba, Neva, and then Nokwanda. I see your hands have lowered, but I don't know if you still have the question, or if you're even online still. Okay, I'm not seeing. Nokwanda, you can go.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I just wanted to quickly pick up from a part of Duma's point and also part of Nampelo's point around, well, Duma's point around part of the sort of employment shortage for younger people in the 2000s was sort of, you know, because employment at the time was essentially directed to the older people. I suppose part of the point that Duma was making was that maybe part of it was that young people didn't have skills. And so with the limited number of jobs, the people that eventually won out were the older people. And putting that together with Nompelo's point around, you know, what kind of experiences are learned in 1 year's worth of a program? You know, what are the kinds of skills there that are learned that then ensure future employability? And so taking from both those points, what I want to ask is, what actually is the thought around the sort of integration and putting together these public employment programs with essentially the needs of the country in terms of the infrastructure that is required, in terms of not just the physical infrastructure, you know, also the social infrastructure. And so how do we better integrate these different programs and integrate them into broader economic policy such that, you know, the sort of experiences that people learn are not just in a year where that skill is not necessarily fully translatable, but something that becomes then a sort of long-term career prospect rather than, so essentially re-envisioning the public employment program, not as a stepping stone, as Kate was saying, but something that is more long-term, that is more of a bridge. Thanks.
Thanks, Nokwanda. Neva? You can unmute.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, I think when you talk about the research program, you were talking only about impacts. I mean, I think one of the key aims of evidence-based research is actually to understand what leads to this problem persisting, and therefore, how do we address those causalities, not just to look at impact, which is really more about rational altruism. And in this case, the issue for me would be this: if we're serious about pathways, do we understand what happens when people leave that leads to them not developing their own livelihoods? And can we think of how would we then improve the coordination, as Kate was saying, so that when they leave, there is a more coordinated process to support people getting those kinds of livelihoods? Because what worries me is if we don't have that research, we're all just, you know, we always fall back on skills, and yet we know that skills is often not the key issue. It's often things like, you know, how do you get inputs? How do you get finance? How do you find a site for wherever you are? How do you get markets? All of those kinds of issues. Is there any way of thinking about how we do that research as well? Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panel to respond, but also to wrap up. So I'll give you each a minute to answer the last questions and to say any concluding remarks. I'm going to take it in the order which you spoke. So with Kate, and then we'll go to Zach, Bhavinesh, and then Duma.
Yes, I think in terms of the research agenda, I think it's not just looking at impacts, and we certainly take note of what you're saying there, Neva. I don't think any of the final questions were particularly directed to me. I'm going to leave some of that to Bhavinesh. I think the message here really is that we need differentiated strategies across the spectrum of the unemployed. So at the top end, for those who are closer to the labor market, yes, Nakwando, there are ways of designing programs so that they optimize the linkages to needs in the wider economy. And we've seen that with, for example, we've had graduate programs with the universities that have provided work relevant to people's area of expertise. We've had work with the Water Research Commission that has supported people in the water sector and water graduates in the water sector. We have had, we are trying to develop approaches that look at digitizing public records to give people digital skills linked to digital markets. So definitely at the top end of the market where public employment programs can function as an active labor market policy, there are ways of designing the programs to optimize those linkages and pathways. But we're still left with that 90% of people who just aren't going to make it into the labor market. And I think that's where a lot of the focus today has been, is how do we get better at this interface between public employment and livelihoods and self-employment and entrepreneurship. And I think we're at the early stages of that journey. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from what's already happened. Bhavinesh didn't actually give figures, but 6,000 new micro-enterprises have been formed from within the Social Employment Fund by participants. Over 6,000 existing micro-enterprises have had support through SEF. And I think the figures about 1,500 participants have exited permanently into sustainable self-employment. Now, these are early stage results, but they are giving us lessons about what can be done better. And so this is a very fluid, if you like, area in relation to the way forward with public employment, is how do we strengthen that interface? And what is the role of the SME support ecosystem in meeting us on that journey? Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Let's take Zach for his concluding comments and any responses to the question. Zach?
Sure. Thank you very much, Saul. And thank you for all the questions. I don't think I have much to add. I think Kate really hit the nail on the head with what's trying to be doing, and the sort of the message that there has to be differentiated strategies, and it can't only be the responsibility of public employment to take responsibility for transitions into better economic progress and more resilient livelihood opportunities. Also, maybe just like to end by saying, there's 12.4 million unemployed people, and we've spoken a lot about exits and pathways, and I hope we can maybe have a follow-up discussion someday on the social value that these people are bringing to their communities and our society and our country, and really making it a better place to live in, which is another whole conversation to be had. That's exponential impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Bhavinesh?
To that issue of savings, so I mean, savings, like many of the other issues we're looking at over here, are complex issues. There's there's issues of institutions, there's issues of it could be cultural issues, whatever it is, but it's deeply complicated issues that we are dealing with over here. And I think a common theme that we've seen trying to solution this is better policy coordination, get people who know how to solve these things, get them involved in tackling some of these challenges, and then better partnering. I think that's been a big thing, just better partnering, because these complex challenges cut across the sectors of government, civil society, business, and so forth. So do the solutions, and so do the resources. So just better coordination and better resourcing. Maybe just one final thing from my side, and it gives me tremendous hope, is that there are good people doing good things out there in communities, solving things. And, as individuals, whether in our own capacities or as businesses, as sectors, if we can go and find those people and help support them and so forth, then I think we've done our part.
Thank you so much. It ends on a little bit of a depressing note, but I just want to say that I do talk to South Africans almost on a weekly basis about Vision 2035, how we can lift the labour demand through a whole series of interventions. So now back to this discussion, I do believe when we talk about this thing, we must establish a new quasi-public institution with professional management and civil society oversight that merges these three PEPs, Jobs Fund, the National Youth Service, Public Employment Services within the Department of Labour. And I did say so when Penny interviewed me, as well. We must abolish the employment tax incentive, 4.8 billion for the past year, and we must see the institution with a large portion of the 140 billion UIF surplus. I just want to say, I'm a bit worried. I'll go out and see them. People need to understand that we created in 16 years 101.5 million full formal jobs. That is less than 100,000 jobs a year. So you grow one SME for Kate's business, and then Avenic's business suffers. So it's a zero-sum game. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's what I'm saying. So we must develop the capacity to create full-time jobs. I know some people do want part-time jobs, but we must have a focus on full-time jobs. These are permanent, without necessarily having an exit, but they have more meaning, because I was talking to Vusi Nhlapra and he was telling me about the community works program. It seems like on the spectrum, it's one of the lowest quality jobs that you have. And let's improve the quality of work, training, access to savings, maybe SME trade, whatever. Minimum standards, it has to be above the inadequate minimum wage, because the basic education initiatives, my understanding, it is at that level. But how can we bring the others? And the last thing I want to say is that I was presenting about 3-4 weeks ago at the Labour School, and they were all the Labour leaders. They're all supportive, but all of them are very skeptical about public employment because of the terrible working conditions, the way they perceive it, And so we must improve the quality of work, with minimum standards, benefits, and all of that. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists and our discussant and everyone who joined online and in the room. For those in the room, there is lunch at the back. And thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.